What's the problem? From Marx's perspective, and I would say from Spinoza's also, the problem is called alienation, which means separation. All kinds of alienation. Alienation of ourselves from what changes our labor effects in the world, of ourselves, our desires and decisions from our activity itself, which we don't even choose. Think about that. Do you choose what you do at work? Do you choose what you do at school? Alienation from the whole big world, which seems so hopelessly beyond us, though it is only the sum of our and everybody else's labor that makes that world and sustains it. Alienation from other people, from society, from those richer and those poorer than you. Alienation from reality, we might add, by means of media. The problem is alienation. And so, incidentally, the solution is reconnection. The first thing that Marx asks you to do that I think you might be hesitant to do is to question capitalism. You should note that what you are taught in your economy classes and in your business classes assumes all the things Marx thinks really ought to be asked about. Private property, wage labor, profit, division of labor, competition, money. We are led to believe these are all just natural, but Marx knows they are not. They're historically established, and their domination of our lives corresponds with a certain small class's domination. And incidentally, destruction of the globe. The question is, what hides behind private property, wage labor, profit, division of labor, competition, and money? What exists without those things or before those things? And how precisely are they established historically and maintained day to day? Marx's answer to that is they're established through a series of profound alienations. Historically, we could say by proletarianization and by enclosure. Now, these concepts aren't in this text, but proletarianization means the turning of people into beings with no means to sustain themselves physically. This is part of what he's talking about when he talks about alienation of the physical world. A wage laborer or a proletarian is a person who cannot live unless they sell their activity to somebody else. We experience wage slavery. And then enclosure, historically, that means sealing off the resources that would sustain life from the people who previously used those resources. Water supplies, shared forests, fields, and so on. Capitalism was established through a long and brutal process of proletarianization and enclosure. That's in Europe. In the New World and other colonial settings, it was established through genocide, proletarianization, and enclosure. Oh, and just to complete the story, in both Europe and in European colonies, this process included the subjugation of women to men and the establishment of elaborate hierarchies, especially racial ones. That's right, race was imposed through colonial takeover. But Marx's text is more specific than this, and the historical story isn't here. I'm citing primarily Silvia Federici, who we'll read later. So we're reading Marx from like 1844. This is the humanist Marx, the younger Marx, before his more detailed and scientific writing in Das Kapital. Here it's much more obvious what Marx thinks is natural for humans and what is our natural involvement with nature. He calls this relation metabolic. He means that we are simply a part of the natural world, a determinate locus within a certain portion of the earth, its surface. This region of nature, which is human, involves an ongoing reciprocal action. Humans work on nature, physically changing it, and nature works on humans, physically constraining and channeling their activities. We are not free from nature, but we are active shapers of it. Meanwhile, the shaped nature, thus the human or humanized nature which surrounds us, is never just fields and forests. It's all manner of artifact and architecture. We don't live in the same nature our grandparents did. Our nature is filled with communications radiation, greater and greater armaments, 12-lane freeways, pretty soon self-driving cars. To get even more specific, since nature is just the physical world, our real material circumstances, we can include here that we are born into a situation where capital and opportunity are specifically distributed to the few who make determinations for the many. The basis of the control of the capitalist class is their control of the means of production. That is, the resources, factories, transportation, and communication systems through which food, shelter, clothing, and so on, the goods that meet our needs, are controlled by a few people. And because the rest of us lack them, those people control us and are able to seize our labor and make us do whatever work they demand, because otherwise we'll die. Marx thinks this is extremely problematic and will necessarily have to be changed sooner or later by force. The change would involve taking the means of life back from the few and figuring out how to have the many control those means of life. Oh, and incidentally, one of the many obstacles to this endeavor is that the few, the capitalists, also control the means of the production and distribution of ideas, things like the media, publishing industries, even the universities. They distribute the ideas that serve them, and we, since we lack the means to produce and distribute ideas, are subject to the ones they give us. We therefore tend to think as they need us to, and this includes our believing in God. So, where Marx thinks naturally we exist in a symbiotic feedback loop with the physical world, working on it, giving it form according to our wishes and thoughts, this would be free labor, capitalism gives us a situation where this loop is broken, and we are alienated, that is, separated, from that physical world and from one another. Capitalism breaks our free relation to the world, and it also breaks community. And it breaks down freedom, which requires self-determined activity. Instead, we have our activity determined for us by our bosses and our teachers. So Marx talks about 4 types of alienation. 1, of the object we produce. 2, of our own activity in the labor we have to do lest we die. 3, of our species and of the whole physical world which we as a species operate upon. 4, of other people, locally and globally. 1, alienation of the object. In capitalist circumstances, what I produce has its value because I produced it, and yet I don't own it. The owner of the factory or shop where I work owns it. That's the law. They also, incidentally, own my labor. They own me for 8 or 10 hours a day. We call it a free society, but it's not. And then my unfree labor produces an object which is owned by, sold, and profited on by those who control me. And on the large scale, the whole human workforce produces massive changes to the world and massive piles of goods, all of which are not determined by us and which don't belong to us. The harder we work, the more pretty objects there are in stores which we can't afford. We produce an alienated world. Number 2, alienation of our activity. For the most part, the work we do when at work is not the work we would ever choose to do just for ourselves. We do it, of course, because we need the money. And we need the money in order to meet our and our family's needs. This work doesn't make us healthier. It makes us weaker, slouchier, and chubbier. And it doesn't make us smarter. It makes us duller. In fact, the result of spending our best hours slaving for somebody else's profit is that we only feel like ourselves when we get home, slouch on the couch, crack a beer, and watch TV. That is, we come to feel like ourselves only when we're passive and consuming. Our very nature as intelligent actors who can change the world is lost because we only experience activity as enslaved, unfree activity. Number 3, alienation of species being. Now, this is definitely the most opaque of Marx's notions, which is because he's taking it from Hegel. In later work, he'll avoid phrasings like species being. But he seems to be trying to say that humanity as a species labors together so as to change the face of the globe, so as to change the whole of earthly nature. And yet any decisions about how the whole world will be changed are taken by a select few. We're excluded from it. Similarly, most of us are excluded from the buildings that surround us, all of which were constructed by previous generations of labor, possibly even including our own families. And then secondly, Marx thinks there's a tragedy in the fact that the whole of human labor is deployed at the direction of and for the benefit of a select few, the owners. This means that instead of individuals working for the good of the whole works for the good of a select few individuals. This violates our nature as social creatures. 4. Alienation from other humans. We are separated from others in this system because A, we all like to hang out in our homes with our screens, away from other bodies. Even if we communicate with others, physically we are isolated. B, there exists an ever more detailed division of labor, where people who do different types of work are physically segregated and over time lose commonality and so can't and don't talk anymore. C, there exist classes of people whose interests are opposed. Workers need shorter hours, better pay, better benefit. Owners require longer hours, greater productivity, minimal wages, minimal benefits. And then D, recall that the very establishment of a capitalist system required breakage of the communities pre-existing that, communities with extensive kinship networks, extended families, and tight relations with physical places which they controlled. Capitalism destroys all of this. And then lastly, what about God? Marx thinks that religious practice, he's got in mind Christian practice primarily, but he himself was from a Jewish family, though he's an atheist. His claim is that religion exists, and people are so emotionally connected to it because the world is set up for them to suffer in. Because they are alienated from what they do and who is around them, because they are exploited and suffering, they like to dream a substitute for this suffering. They like to dream a wholeness, a happiness, a situation of non-exploitation. That's what religion achieves. Religion is the opiate of the masses. Actually, Marx is coming from Feuerbach here, the generation before him, an earlier materialist, who theorized that God was just a projection of human capacities, a projection and alienation. Because we are powerful, that is, we can achieve things, make changes to the world, and very big things, when millions work together, we come to call God omnipotent. The potentia here is from what humans really are. We're powerful, but our power is inhibited by the structures that structure us, our activity and our thought. So we end up wishing for and worshiping as separate something that is really us. Similarly, we are rational creatures with the capacity to know, especially to know the physical world. But since we don't live in a free society where we can seek to understand as our mind inclines us, instead we end up projecting our knowing capacity into a God who is omniscient, all-knowing. We wish for what we are, but even in wishing, we set up our own powers as separate and unobtainable. We end up worshiping instead of being powerful and knowing. Marx thinks we ought to cut it out. So what to do? We have to acknowledge the actual layout of the world, the actual situation. Marx thinks this also means ceasing to console ourselves with irrational dogmas that we're not allowed to think about. We need to think about religion itself, see what role it plays in keeping society docile and harmless, and reject it. We need to see clearly in order to act decisively, not just as individuals, but as groups, socially.